Welcome to the webinar, Employers and Inclusive Working Life, Nordic Perspectives on Disability and Work. My name is Noora Tobiasson, and I will be taking care of the practicalities of this webinar. This webinar is arranged by NIVA Education and the Nordic Welfare Centre, both institutions under the Nordic Council of Ministers. Together, we support Nordic cooperation by sharing knowledge and strengthening networks across the region. At NIVA, our mission is to gather knowledge from across the Nordic region and transform research findings into advanced courses, conferences, and webinars within the field of occupational health and safety. In today's webinar, we are joined by the following experts. Kaija Larsen Österud, PhD and researcher at Oslo Metropolitan University. Julia Salado Rasmussen, PhD and senior associate professor at University College Copenhagen. Tor Andreas Bremnes, managing director at INCLU. And William Kode, chairperson of the Danish Association of Youth with Disabilities. In 2025 to 26, the Nordic Welfare Centre is running a project on inclusive working life for persons with disabilities. Before we go over to the presentations, Lars Lindberg from the Nordic Welfare Centre will tell us a few words about the Nordic Welfare Centre and about this project. Lars, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Lars Lindberg and work as the senior advisor at the Nordic Welfare Centre. And the Nordic Welfare Centre is an institution like NIVA under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and our mission is to contribute to the development of welfare initiatives in the Nordic region by compiling and disseminating knowledge on welfare issues. But we also serve as a secretariat for the Council of Nordic Cooperation on Disabilities, consisting of 16 experts, and which is also the Nordic Council of Ministers advisory body on issues related to disabilities, and also following up the Nordic program for the cooperation on disability issues, which is also the basis for our work. Most of our work are focusing on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Nordic Welfare Centre, we are following up the convention being implemented in the Nordic countries through 3 ongoing projects. One of the projects focusing on inclusion work and life, and particular Article 27. And this webinar is a part of this project. And we will also organize more webinars during the year, and the project is funded by the Nordic Labour Market Committee. The other 2 projects we have is focusing on the data and statistics, and the third one on inclusive education. You find more information on nordicwelfare.org, and you can follow the development in the disability field in the Nordic region by subscribing to our newsletter, where we also collect articles and reports and sharing information. And then this you can follow from this QR code. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lars. Great to get some background about the project you have been working on. Now, our first presentation today is by Kaija Larsen Österud from Oslo Metropolitan University. The topic of Kaija's presentation is employer attitudes and hiring practices towards disabled job seekers in Norway. Kaija, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Let's just share my presentation. There we go. So yes, thank you for the introduction. I work as a researcher at the NOVA, Norwegian Social Research, which is a research institute at Oslo Metropolitan University. And this presentation is based on a research project where I participated as a PhD student. So I did my doctoral thesis on this project. It was called the Higher Project, and it was conducted from 2018 to 2022, and it brought new and important knowledge on discrimination of disabled people in the Norwegian labor market. I worked with colleagues from Nova, Elisabeth Ugrenino, Vegard Bjørnshagen, and Jannike Fedler. The higher study had multiple parts, and today I will talk about two of these, the field experiment and the follow-up interviews. So Bjørnshagen and Ugrenino, they conducted the field experiment, and I did the follow-up interviews with employers afterwards. So this field experiment method, also called correspondence studies, is done by sending out fictitious job applications for real jobs and looking at the differences in callback rates to job interviews. So in the higher study, Eugenino and Bjørnshagen did two different experiments. In both, they sent out pairs of applications for different types of jobs, where the candidates were equal in terms of age, education, experience, and gender. The only difference between the candidates in each of these pairs was that one of them disclosed an impairment. So in one experiment, the disabled job seeker was a wheelchair user, and in the other, the candidate explained a gap in their resume with having had mental health problems. And the paired applicant also had a gap, which was explained by having traveling that year. So after the field experiments were conducted, I did 38 interviews, qualitative interviews with employers that had been subjected to the experiment. And this allowed me to ask why the employers chose as they did in that concrete hiring process. Yes, so first let's look at the findings from the field experiment and use the wheelchair user experiment first. These bars, they show the differences in callback rates. As you can see, the non-disabled applicant received a callback for 22% of the applications, while the wheelchair user received a callback for 11% approximately of the applications. So in other words, a wheelchair user must apply for twice as many jobs to get the same number of callbacks as an equally qualified non-disabled job seeker. And these were jobs that were seated and which shouldn't be a problem for a wheelchair user to do. So here we have the result from the mental health experiment. The differences between the candidates here are 28.5% and 20.7% callback. And this means that the job seeker with a history of mental health problems have to apply for 1.4 as many jobs as the non-disabled applicant to get the same number of interview invitations. But what were the employers thinking when they did these selections? And this is something I investigated in the qualitative part of the study. And I will now go over my findings from the interviews from each of the field experiments, just separate them a little bit, and starting with the wheelchair experiment. I have written about these findings in the article pictured here, which is published in the journal Work, Employment and Society. So I interviewed 18 employers subjected to the experiment, both inclusive and discriminatory, and I asked them why they did what they did in the recruitment process. So to understand how discrimination occurs, I draw on several theoretical frameworks, and these help us see why employers often evaluate disabled people less favorably. So I focus on the concept of the ideal worker to explain discrimination against wheelchair users. The ideal worker is an abstract standard that the employers keep in mind when hiring. Initially, this concept was used to show that the ideal worker was typically understood as a man without any caregiving responsibilities. Later research, however, has pointed out that this is not only a gendered norm, but also a non-disabled norm. So the ideal worker is expected to be productive and efficient, able to start the job without any adjustments, and dedicated to the workplace. My interviews show that employers look beyond productivity as well to evaluate this and seek someone who can participate in the social practices that are already established in the workplace. So what I found is that employers tend to make two main types of assessments when evaluating job applicants. These are productivity considerations and social considerations. So I want to do the productivity considerations first. So the employers I spoke with, they generally did not express concerns related to productivity. And this is not very surprising, as these were candidates who did not communicate any form of reduced work capacity and who also had the CV showing that they were employed full-time. A very small number, however, did express reservations. And these were cases where the job required traveling outside the workplace to visit clients or customers. So employers believe this could be time-consuming or difficult to carry out if the client was located in an inaccessible building. So here is a quote from an employer who had advertised a position requiring visits to corporate clients at shopping centers. And he said, "I think that a person with an impairment in the form of a wheelchair in relation to certain work tasks would not work, unfortunately, because of the competitive situation out in the market. We're extremely dependent on being efficient. And obviously, now I'm speaking from a place of ignorance, that a person in a wheelchair would not get out of a car as quickly into a shopping center, through a store, and back into the car to write a report." So for him, this was considered a legitimate reason to reject the applicants. And it's interesting to bring out in the ideal worker here, because you see that in this quote, he's comparing the applicant to this standard person, this abstract normal person, which is used as a benchmark for evaluating a wheelchair user as less efficient. So now let's turn to the social consideration, as these were substantial. Several of the employers struggled to see how a wheelchair user would fit into the organization's existing social structures. And these concerns were based on mainly two things. The first was the idea that it would be difficult for a wheelchair user to participate in various activities the employees usually did together outside of the office. And employers mentioned that traveling abroad or to other parts of Norway, going on boat trips or cabin trips, those types of things could be difficult to carry out with a wheelchair user. And here is a quote from a very small company where such work trips and gatherings were considered essential to participate in. Since we're so small, we have these gatherings every 2 or 3 months where we visit our cabins and country houses and such. So we thought it would be tricky to have someone in a wheelchair. That was really the only reason for not calling him in, because my first thought was that it looked good. The second social consideration that made employers hesitant was their assumptions about disabled people, like stereotypes and prejudices. And one employer said the following, brace yourself: "I'm afraid that could be a C-word or cripple who doesn't contribute, and that they draw energy from the group instead, in a way." And at first I was a bit shocked about how blunt this statement was. But at the same time, it is valuable that it was said out loud, because it exposes the reality that many disabled people have to navigate. So now we go over to the findings from the follow-up interviews from the mental health experiment. And these findings have been published in the pictured article in the journal Sociology of Health and Illness. As I now turn to my findings on why and how employers discriminate against people with mental health problems, I use stigma as a framework to shed light on these processes. Stigma concerns certain groups of people to whom we attach negative traits. These individuals carry aspects of their identity that are often associated with shame and taboo, things that are difficult to speak openly about. So stigma is a concept that's widely used in social research on mental illness. And the sociologist Irving Goffman, who's famously used this term, he's described stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting, reducing a person from being whole and normal to someone who is inferior and tainted. And since his work, many different understandings of stigma have been developed, and I draw on an approach that emphasizes stigma as a process, Link and Phelan, which is I put here in the slide. And this process begins with a group being given a label that is seen as meaningful, such as the label mentally ill. And this label is then linked to negative stereotypes, and the group is set apart as someone different from us, separation. And finally, stigma involves status loss and discrimination. People in the group are treated differently and denied access to a community. So mental illness is stigmatized. People with mental health problems are assigned a label and connected to negative stereotypes. And we see from the field experiment that discrimination does occur. But what did it look like among the employers that I spoke with? It was clear to me that stigma played a role. Employers reacted more strongly to openness about mental health than they did to the wheelchair user. And they were more focused on how the candidate disclosed their mental health problems. And as a result, some saw such openness as a lack of social competence. And this reflects the power of stigma. It pushes people to conform, to feel shame, and hide parts of themselves. And several employers told me that they reacted negatively to the candidate's openness. And one employer put it this way: I remember thinking that this was a bit too much. I kind of thought, oh, is this one of those people who doesn't understand boundaries? Who's like, whoa, always unloading. In addition to reacting to the openness itself, many employers relied on negative stereotypes when evaluating the candidate. The employers who discriminated clearly associated mental health problems with negative traits. So people with mental health problems were linked to characteristics such as being unstable, fragile, and not entirely trustworthy. This applied to attendance and potential sickness absence, but it was also connected to the social environment. And some employers said that they feared that this person might have outbursts that would negatively affect the workplace atmosphere. So people with mental health problems were especially seen as individuals who would struggle in social environments. And a daycare employer expressed it like this: I think it's easier to accommodate if you have a job where you work mostly by yourself. It's easier to make adaptations for mental instability than if you're going to be in direct contact with others. So this quote reveals an expectation of instability and an assumption that people with mental health problems are particularly fragile in social professions. And I heard similar views from several of these employers. So what stigma does then is to create expectation about how one ought to behave. And part of that is the belief that one should not be too open. And at the same time, stigma generates ideas about negative traits supposedly shared by people in this label group. And this paves the way for discrimination. Employers use this label and stereotypes, often drawing on a single poor experience, to reject the applicant. And they do so without even speaking to the person. The experiences they referred to were often superficial, and they referred to them as someone who disappeared into sick leave, whom they barely spoke to and never saw again. I also examined how the employers related to previous experience with employees with mental health problems. And according to the contact hypothesis, first formulated by the psychologist Gordon Allport quite some time ago, is that contact with people are considered members of an outgroup will positively affect the attitudes held towards that group. So the question is if employers with such experience evaluated the candidate more positively. And the answer is both yes and no, because it depended on the type of experience that they had. Some employers referred to negative experience as grounds for discriminating the candidate. However, as I touched upon, this experience was superficial. Their previous employees who had mental health problems had often disappeared into sickness absence without any dialogue with the employer. And as this quote illustrates, and as an employer, the sick note you get doesn't state the cause of the absence. And then you're supposed to provide adaptation and all that, so that's a bit difficult. So in these instances, the employer knew little about the employees' struggles, and they did not really talk to each other. And this is contrasted by the employers who used experience to positively evaluate the fictitious candidate. They refer to a close dialogue where they challenged imperatives of taboo by talking about it. And in this way, they helped create their own positive experience, which in turn made them more positive towards inclusion afterwards. And this brings me to my final point. So to end on a more positive note, I want to emphasize some points about the employers that chose to invite the disabled candidate to an interview. Because these employers, they looked beyond the ideal worker, they looked beyond stigma, and they chose to invite the candidate. It can be useful to see what they said and what they did, so we can use this knowledge to create a more inclusive working life. So an important finding is that the employers who chose to discriminate often view disability as an individual problem. They saw disability and health issues as something that arose and was maintained at the individual level. They emphasized that the person themselves should take responsibility for causing as little trouble as possible, whether that meant informing them in advance that they used a wheelchair or that they had received extensive treatments and tools to stay healthy. The inclusive employers, on the other hand, they had a more, what I would call a relational perspective. They recognized that both managers and the workplace played a role in shaping a person's functional capacity. They were willing to take responsibility for making adjustments and engaging in dialogue, hereby creating a good working environment for both parties. And when we think about this ideal worker, we can say that the inclusive employers were less guided by this abstract idea. They were more open to adaptation and make the most of the actual people that were in the workplace. Another important characteristic of inclusive employers was that they dared to go into this dialogue that I mentioned, especially in the cases involving mental health issues. While those who discriminated used this negative experience as justification for discrimination, they instead used their positive experiences as a basis for inclusion. But how do such positive experience arise? They arise through this empathetic dialogue between manager and employee. And they talk together and they remove this power of stigma. They made it easier for them to understand the employee, and the employee could receive accommodations that made it easier to stay in work. So I uphold this dialogue as a tool for inclusion. It weakens stigma and taboo, and it makes it easier for employee to bring things up, and it creates a positive experience for the employer. But it is important that this employers are the ones who need to engage this first, because openness has a real penalty, as we saw in the field experiment. So the employer need to initiate this. Yes. Now I think I've come to the end. I won't go into this whole summary, but if you want to read more, there are a lot of publications from this project. I've listed the most relevant ones for this presentation here. So if you want to read, that's they are open. So thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kaja. Next up is a presentation by Julia Salado Rasmussen on the topic Danish employers' perspectives on inclusion of people with mobility disabilities.
Hi, my name is Julia Salado Rasmussen. I'm a senior associate professor at the Department of Social Work at the University College Copenhagen. I will present our study on Danish employers' perspectives on inclusion of people with mobility disabilities. I will start with the social problem. As many of you probably already know, work gives access to one of the most important arenas in society, the workplaces, as well as income, independence, identity, and a lot of other good things, meaningfulness for many employees. We have also seen decades of strategies and policies to improve equal opportunities and avoid discrimination of persons with disabilities. However, even though employment rates are quite high in Denmark, we still see a substantial employment gap between people with disabilities and without disabilities. Furthermore, we know that employers, they play a crucial role in recruiting people, deciding who to dismiss, deciding who to call when they need a new employee. So we know that they are key players in that regard. But we know surprisingly little about what is actually important for them. Why do they take the decisions they do that can negatively affect people with disabilities? So in this presentation, I will draw on a study called the Bevika project, which has both a qualitative part and a qualitative part. And as we only have 20 minutes here, I won't have time to tell nearly half of what's in the project, but I will pick out some of the interesting results. So first of all, we did a quantitative survey, and the purpose of this survey was to examine Danish employers' attitudes and behaviors towards recruiting people with disabilities, and especially in this case, mobility disabilities. So that was the first part. And this study is based on a survey among employers, public as well as private, to examine their attitudes and behavior regarding recruitment. And the data is collected by a web-based survey and also interviews. And the data included 5,000 workplaces with a response rate around 41%, which is quite good data set we have here. So what did the survey show? Well, it showed that when we asked employers As a workplace, do you have a social obligation to recruit persons with disabilities? Well, then we see that 74% actually state that they completely or predominantly agree with that statement, which of course is very positive. However, when we ask them if they actually do have employees with a mobility impairment, in this case described as a wheelchair user as an example, we can see that only a quarter of the employers have experiences. So there is quite differences between whether they think it's their responsibility and whether they do actually hire. We also looked at two important dimensions in our survey concerning job functions and accessibility. And as you can see here, only half of the workplaces actually are accessible for persons, for example, a wheelchair user, and have job functions. So that means that the other half actually lack job opportunities for wheelchair users, which of course is negative for them. So based on this survey, we took two central questions: whether they have a positive attitude toward recruiting, the social obligation, and whether they actually did hire. And based on these two questions, we could make a typology of the employers, as you here will see. So if we look at the dimension of negative or positive behavior towards having a social obligation to recruit persons with mobility impairments, we can see that in that corner we have what we call the committed employer. And the committed employer is an employer who actually think it's our obligation to recruit people with disabilities, and who actually also do so, which means they actually do have employees or have had it early on. In the opposite direction, we can see employers, as we here refer to as the dismissive employer. That is employers who say, no, we don't think we have a social obligation to recruit people with disabilities, and no, we don't either have that. Then we also have the passive employers. That's the one in the corner there. The passive employers are the employers who have stated, yes, we have a social obligation, we just don't have any employees who have a disability and no experience of having it earlier on. And lastly, we have the skeptical employer in the corner there, constituting only 4%, who are the employers who says, no, we don't have a social responsibility for employing, but we actually do have some employees with disabilities. And what I like to draw out from this typology is that there is a potential. We have 54% of the employers who actually claim that they do, to some extent, modest or high degree, do have a social obligation to recruit people with disabilities. So there is a potential here, they just haven't done it yet. And based on this typology and the results from the quantitative survey, we were curious in, okay, but what factors actually influence whether they do hire or not? And we looked at that also quantitatively in this study, but I won't go more into the quantitative data now. I will instead move on to the qualitative study, where we wanted to examine the employers' experiences with hiring and retention of people with mobility disabilities. What motivates them and what facilitates hiring and retention. And the data for this study is based on interviews with employers at 20 Danish workplaces who either had one or several employees with a mobility disability. And we choose this best case design because we thought, okay, if you want to learn something about what actually work when you hire people with disabilities, which factors are important to make it work, well then let's look at the ones who are actually doing it and learn something from them. Geographically, we chose employers in Zealand, Fyn and Jutland, so we got across in Denmark. We had both private and public workplaces, large and small. We also had employees who had experiencing hiring and recruiting persons with disabilities, and also some who had experience retaining people. For example, employees who got a disease and thus had to have some accommodations at the workplace. We also had both employees in ordinary employment and also in flex job. And flex jobs, that is a Danish subsidized employment scheme for people with reduced work capacity, where the municipalities pay some of the salary. And finally, we also made sure that we had both employees with disability caused by diseases in development, and also employees in our study that had permanent disabilities, for example, amputations. So the first thing we were quite interested in exploring was the reasons and the motivations for why these employers had chosen to employ or retain these employees with disabilities. And the first story we call the personal story. It came to us very fast because when we called these employers, and most of them recruited through the quantitative survey, where we could find employers who had registered that they had employees with disabilities. When we called them and said, well, can we do an interview with you? Then they would already in the phone start telling us about their personal reasons or personal story for doing this. Typically because they had a brother, a sister, a child, a husband with a disability, and they wanted the society to help their family, but they also want to do something good themselves as employers for another person with disability. There are also some of them who told about personal experience with being in vulnerable situation, for example, due to it could be a drug abuse or other problems that had at a point in their life made them vulnerable on the labor market, and thus they wanted to help somebody else now standing in a vulnerable situation. Of course, some of the employers also pointed to the social responsibility, as is well known and also written across the literature. And that was typically the bigger companies who said, okay, well, we have a desire to take social responsibility. We are a big company, we make a lot of money. We should do something also locally to help. Then again, there were employers who said, well, we do it from what we call business model, or we have called it here in our analysis the business model, which was factors related to the workplace or the nature of work. For example, that they had hard time recruiting employees and found the job center as a good point of entry to get new employees, especially if they could also maybe have the employees to begin with in an internship where they didn't have to pay for the training of the employee. And these trees are like illustrated within the little house you can see on the slide, because that's factors that comes from within the companies. But as you can see, we have a fourth dimension, which is the external initiative, because there are also some very, very clear examples in our study on employers who didn't have any specific motive or reason for doing this. The only reason that they had hired this specific employee with a disability, well, that was actually because somebody knocked their door. It could be a friend or a neighbor, or in most cases the job center who had contacted them and said, well, we have an employee a candidate that might match your workplace, and then they had hired. And I think that's also important to have in mind. All the employers out there who could potentially hire, but they probably won't do it before someone knock their door. Then we were also very interested in looking at the factors for hiring that could facilitate hiring and retention. And here we could see that several employers, they point out that there has been a need for flexibility in cooperation with the job center. And this flexibility concerns both contact and access to job center in connection with practical needs, but also flexibility to negotiate, arrange how this employment and hiring process could work also for them as an employer. For example, maybe they would feel that there were a need to an internship beforehand to see if the employee could actually do the work. So these times of negotiation was, at least from the employer perspective, pointed out as important. They also provide examples of how the employees make an effort to be flexible to ensure that employment works. For example, by, as the quote I will just tell in a moment, try to deliberately limit the number of sick days by using their vacation days. So I think I'll just take the quotation now. And this is from a public employer. But she knows that she can come at any time and say, I can feel that I need to take care of myself now. Can I have an extra day off tomorrow? Then she gets an extra day off tomorrow. Quite often it's themselves who pay for it with time off or vacation day. She does not want it to get out to her staff and say, well, name is often sick. They know she has the illness. We respect her work, and her professional skills. She has been here for many years. So I think we give something and she gets something. So this is an example of an employee who tried to adjust and accommodate by using her vacation days instead of sick days. This is my example where you can say, okay, could there have been a better solution if there had been a strong collaboration with the job center? But at least that's how they express it here. We also see that some of the smaller employers often have a more direct opportunity to make hiring decisions themselves, while the larger workplaces typically require the involvement of several managers, several levels. And thus some of them, they also describe that they, as employers, well, they have to be quite determined, use a lot of agency in making these employment work, because there's an example of an employer who wants to hire a person who lacks leg amputee and has to convince her manager that it's okay and that the person will be able to carry out the work. Yeah. So they describe that they must also have the willingness to argue to make the employment work. And in that regard, they describe that having the right knowledge is completely crucial for them, because if they have knowledge about the disability or the illness, and maybe also relevant information about support and compensation schemes, then they can much better argue within the organization in whether this is a bad or good decision. Furthermore, we also see that when they have knowledge about disability, illness, compensation schemes, how to collaborate with the job center, well, then they feel it reduces the risk that they are taking as an employer. And that also links closely to the last one about openness, because they describe, several of them, that it's important that the employee can be open about their disability and their illness, because they need to know, are you going into a tough treatment period where you might have more sick days, or where are you right now in the development of your disease? That will help them also plan. And that is one of the things that's crucial, is that the ability to plan and organize the work is very, very important for the employer. Absence is problematic in itself, but it is especially when the absence due to illness occur on a short notice, then they really explain that it can cause problems for them. And therefore, they really stress that if they have an employee which is open and realistic about their disease, well, then it actually helps a lot, because then they can accommodate and plan around the illness. Of course, there are also stories, even though these are the committed employers who want to do the right thing and do the right thing when it comes to hiring, they also express that it gets hard sometimes. So regardless of the motivation for hiring or retaining an employee, we see several examples of that they have some form of threshold for when it makes sense for them. And in most cases, it's about planning, productivity, and finances, as I was into before. So they feel that as managers, they cannot ignore if an employee over an extended period of time is unable to perform the job appropriately. Then they have to step in and say, well, this doesn't work anymore. So the quote here is, so one thing is the issue with the disability, and there's also an economic aspect to it. I mean, when we have to assign a substitute all the time, so there is something financial, something related to the planning, and there's also an aspect regarding the group of citizens we work with and the college. So I think there are many considerations. But right in situations as employers, we need to dare to take the responsibility and say it's not working, and say, well, put the cards on the table. We should not be afraid of addressing it. So what she describes here is that they have to be able to talk about it, and also tell an employee when it doesn't work anymore, when they're no longer able to carry out the job or the functions they were originally employed to do. But again, here we also see that these employers, because they want to do the right thing, they think they have a social obligation to do the right thing, well, then they say, I'd rather give a person a chance for 2 years, and then if her illness get that bad that she can't carry out the task, well, then we have to take it in 2 years and see what we can do instead, or if I have to fire her. Another thing we can see here is that there is all the time an underlying assumption of the able body when they talk about how work is organized. And that's kind of a line that the person with disabilities keeps on being measured against. What would the person without disability be able to do? We also see another interesting thing in our study, and that is what these employers describe as a risk of the problems that could occur. And these employers, as I just mentioned with the example, well, they say, well, they're not afraid of taking a tough management decision if it comes to that point. So they don't themselves show a risk of this avoidance behavior. But when we look at our empirical data in the qualitative study and the quantitative study, well, there could be an explanation around this avoidance behavior when we look at the discrepancy between attitudes and behavior. Are some employers reluctant to hire persons with disabilities because they are maybe to some degree afraid of the conflicts that could arise in the future if the disability worsens? So I won't go through this table, there's not enough time for that, but it's just to say that the employers, this is from their perspective, but still they have an eye for that this need to have knowledge, flexibility, openness, and agency. It actually concerns all the 3 parts involved in making these employments work. So lastly, to sum up, as I said in the beginning, well, the majority of Danish employers state that they have a social obligation to recruit people with disabilities. But unfortunately, we see that only a smaller portion of the employers have or have had employees with mobility impairments. We also see this potential to involve more employers, especially the passive employers who are 54%. And we also see that the motivation for hiring is influenced by various factors: personal experiences, social responsibility, business considerations, but also just the external initiative from job centers or other actors. Somebody knocked the door. And again, successful employment and retention depends on knowledge, flexibility, openness, and agency among both job centers, employers, and employees. And lastly, I will point to that a more proactive job center outreach approach could most likely strengthen work inclusion. There are effective methods out there that can support work inclusion, for example, supported employment or individual placement and support, or in general doing more job development, reaching out to employers. So that could be a way forward also for this target group. Thank you for listening. I hope you found the presentation interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. Now it's time to move forward to some comments on these findings. First, we will hear comments from Tor Andreas Bremnes from INCLU, and after that from William Kode from the Danish Association of Youth with Disabilities. Tor, what are your thoughts and comments on these findings?
Thank you so much for giving the opportunity to speak on this. Just shortly to let everybody know, considering William is for the Danish Association of People with Disability, INCLU is a company owned by the Norwegian Association of People with Disability as well. And the reason why they started the INCLU is to increase the numbers and to understand the market situation for people with disability in the workforce. So this research is in many ways a good example of why we need data-based research to undermine what a lot of us already see and experience in the workforce so far. And the nice thing about these numbers is, as especially got said, I think in both of them, with the fact that we don't think that anybody gets up in the morning and say, well, how can I discriminate today? It's, as being said, it's more like a passive attitude, a passive employer that might want to do something about this if given the opportunity or given the push. And to see 54% being those passive employers that we can actually work with is great news as well. I am particularly interested in the social construct of this because when we talk to employers, especially in Norway, the social construct that we do this to give something back or give somebody an opportunity to reflect the society we live in is often the explanation for employers. And I see very little talk about the benefits of the competency that people with disability actually has and gets through a lifetime. To get one example, we usually live in a world that is not for us, it's not made for us, and it has different hindrances. And as you saw, especially on Kaya's presentation as well, the reasoning for saying no thank you is usually related to assumptions on productivity and social construct barriers in the workplace, which I mean is totally solvable if you are willing to have those conversations with the candidates as well. And the most exciting thing is also that when we come to interviews with a disability, it's not really the disability they see before the competencies, but it's their assumption about what that disability will lead to. And from our experience, when we talk to the candidates as well, the assumptions is usually much more easier to work with when the actual issue with the adaptability is. So it's kind of like catastrophing in the mind of the employers, while it's easier to adapt when you actually go into figuring out why this is happening. So I really appreciate the research because that helps us talk to the employers as well. And knowing that the employers don't want to discriminate, but it's just a lack of either knowledge or trying. But I do wish that we can come into the panel discussion also as well into how we can make it, how to go from passive to inclusive, especially considering competencies as well, and include that works with recruitment processes mainly. Also see that when we talk about people with disability as a strength, employers actually also see that it's beneficial for the business model as well. And I can give one example when we worked with Nordic, which works with election observers services. The one thing they said to us before we started was, we can do a lot of things. We can adapt to a lot of different needs and behaviors, but the only thing we naturally can't do is have a election observer that is visually impaired, that is, for instance, blind. And we said, well, let's see what we get, let's see what we are able to work with. And they got a candidate that was extremely well qualified, but was legally blind based on the merits. And we talked to them about what that hindrances is, how that can work, and what examples we had on how we can solve the issues that they were afraid of. Now, based on the research both of you presented, it was a fear that it would be extra work. It was a fear that, we weren't able to adapt to those needs. But when we looked at her strength and what she could offer, and looked at the possibilities of flex work and how we can solve that issue, they ended up hiring her anyway. And they sent her to a mission 2 weeks after her training. And they were blown away about the details in her reporting and what she saw that nobody else saw. So not only was it an accessible issue and possibility to do something about that, but she also delivered a report or a work that was better presented, better represented that they had done before. So the quality of the report were higher. And that's sort of where think we need to take the shift to talk about hiring people with disability, not only as being nice to them, but also seeing what can we use that knowledge base for, that problem solving skill, that way of thinking outside the box, figuring out new solutions to actually benefit the businesses as well. So I want to thank you both for delivering great research that undermines everything we do with the employers, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tor. Next up, some comments on the findings from William. William, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to get the opportunity to speak to all of you. As Nora said, I am the chairperson of the Associated Youth with Disabilities in Denmark. We are an umbrella organization that works politically for the interests of young people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities and diagnoses. Could be ADHD to blindness to muscular dystrophy and so forth. We are working quite intensively with the unemployment rates in Denmark. Therefore, I am very, very interested in these research findings because we need a more qualified dialogue in the society, a dialogue about why people with disabilities are unemployed and what we can do about it. As you've seen in these research findings, we can see that there are a lot of prejudices There are a lot of negative stigma and taboos that creates an uninclusive workplace society for most people. In Denmark, we have record high employment rates. Almost everybody is in Denmark, but unfortunately, the group of people with disabilities that are unemployed are getting higher and higher. Of course, that makes a lot of people nervous. What do we do when the situation or the momentum changes and we have lower employment rates? Will it be even harder for people with disabilities to get into jobs and get better educations when the momentum shifts or changes? As Kaya said in her presentation, we can see that wheelchair users must apply for twice as many job applications to receive equal amounts of callbacks. I think that is in some way, shape, or form because of the philosophy of the ideal worker. There are quite many norms, I would say unrealistic norms that are impossible to meet as a human being, norms of how do you become the ideal worker, or what does it mean to be the ideal worker. And I don't think in the real world that the ideal worker actually exists. So I think it's very, very important to talk about some of the structural barriers that are and what the consequences of these barriers are, both in a macro perspective, but also in the individual perspectives and the lives of individuals that are meeting these structural barriers. So there are these different productivity concerns that says that people with disabilities or wheelchair users are less efficient in their workplaces, and therefore it's not possible for the private sphere to create a lot of money with people with disabilities in their workforce. Of course, that's a prejudice that's not totally coherent with the real world. I actually believe that if you are able to create a truly inclusive workplace, it becomes more efficient. I used to say that inclusion is innovation and innovation is inclusion. You cannot innovate a workplace, innovate new ideas, new philosophies, new ways of working if you don't understand how inclusion works. Innovation is a way of fixing a problem, a way of working out around a barrier or changing difficulties. You cannot work around problems if you don't include the different needs that are inside these problems or around the problems. So I think it's very exciting to talk about stigma and taboos. And in my organization, we have this term or this word that we call inner barriers. You can also call them internal barriers or barriers on the inside. So there are a lot of structural barriers around us in the society that we meet, and these barriers can make our disability or impairment bigger or smaller due to the specific situation. But in Denmark, we have to use a lot of our time again and again and again to tell municipalities and different kinds of workplaces what we can do and what we cannot do. It's very hard to get the help that you actually need in Denmark because we are in a situation where we want to use less money on this on the space with people with disabilities. So therefore, we have to tell our stories and tell our needs and why we have these certain needs again and again and again through our childhood and through our youth. So this constant dialogue, this constant communication of specific and individual needs creates these internal barriers on the inside, which in some way hold you back from getting to your true potential. So therefore, we have great results with working with young people with disabilities and their internal barriers. So you can imagine if you have used 20 years of your life over communicating what your needs are and how to meet your needs, it can be very difficult overnight to switch the communication method and talk about why you are the right person for this specific job. In a job interview, it can be very hard to sell yourself and your talent and your potential when you are used to talking about everything that we cannot do and what we need help with. Therefore, we have some courses where we specifically help people and train people with disabilities in this conversation that you're supposed to facilitate in meetings and interviews with employers. So we feel that there are too much responsibility on the shoulders of young people with disabilities in these interviews. Therefore, we try to do our best to get the youth ready for these interviews. It could be a way of communicating your disability, but communicating it without creating these stigmas and taboos. Therefore, it's very, very, very important that we help young people to facilitate this dialogue, this conversation with their employers. Yeah, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to speak at this conference, and I think that there are many important perspectives out there that can learn us how to be more inclusive and how to get more people with disabilities in employment. The last thing I would say is that I've seen security workplace in Denmark that are looking at camera footage to see if there happens anything criminal. This workplace has specifically focused on recruiting people with deafness because they believe that if you don't hear as well, you're better to comprehend visual signals. I think that's quite interesting that there are some workplaces in Denmark that specifically try to recruit different kinds of people with different kinds of disabilities. I'm not here to judge whether it's good or bad that they try to recruit these specific disabilities or specific talents, but I just think it's very interesting that we see people understanding that there are different situations and therefore different talents in everybody. Thank you for the word, and now I think we'll go to some questions, right?
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Tor and William, for your very interesting comments and insights. Next, I will ask Kaja and Tor as well to turn on their cameras for the discussion and the Q&A. And let's see, I will try to put us in a... Yes, we are in a gallery. Perfect. Now it's time to take some questions and comments from the participants. You can send in your question through the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or you can click the raise hand button, which is also on the bottom of your screen, and we will ask you to unmute when it's your turn to ask. Okay, but I have a question here. Let's see. Given the strong Nordic tradition of universalism and active labor market policy, why does the disability employment gap remain so persistent? Does any one of you feel like answering that question? Who wants to go first? William, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I honestly think it's because we do not understand that we need to design these employment initiatives specifically for people with disabilities or other kind of, you could call them wicked problems or wicked situations. We always talk about this. In Denmark specifically, we talk about this problem as something that is very, very hard to understand and therefore also very, very hard to work around, a problem that's almost unsolvable. But in Denmark, we haven't tried focusedly to create a solution for this problem. We have tried with a lot of different mechanisms and logics, but nothing that's specifically designed for people with disabilities. So I think that's an answer to understanding that we cannot use initiatives that are not specifically designed for people with disabilities if we want to create better employment rates.
Very good, thank you. And Tor, would you like to continue on that?
Yeah, great comment, William, and I would like to extend that as well. But the thing that shocks me the most is that when we talk about people with disability, it's the world's largest minority. There are so many different needs, there are so many different personalities, competencies, backgrounds, and we're so diverse, like the rest of the society as well. But when we talk about disability, it's this untangible group that makes it hard to go in to figure out what works for disability. That's an impossible question to answer because there's such a variety of answers to do. Now, when we talk about disability, like employment systems, we talk about flexible work that you said from Danish, with some sort of payment, some sort of finance to help employers make this easier. But there's very rarely we talk about hiring processes for people with disability that doesn't necessarily need adaptation, doesn't necessarily need training, because there are a lot of qualified and educated people with disability. But it's also the regular workforce for the normal people, and you have the second lane for people with disability that goes into the workforce with adaptation and needs. And I'm not saying we're not going to have adaptations. I'm not saying we're not going to have need to specialized equipment if we do need that, but we need to broaden the conversation to also talk about competencies, also talk about regular hiring processes that we are a part of, and being acknowledged for the companies and the specialized insights that we do. I did this training once where I tried to calculate how many hours I used on problem solving through the year, because the society was impossible when it comes to adaptation. And I realized that I have about 12 master's degrees in problem solving because I do it every freaking day. But that's a knowledge that the employers need that competencies as well, and I am really good at figuring out alternative solution to a stuck problem. And that's the competency I want us to talk about, where people with disability actually can join the workforce based on competency, and we do the adaptation and the need for training and support as a project that we need the competencies. Here is what we can do to make that competency come to life in our organization. And I think that's why we have the gap, is because we talk about it as a secular thing in the workforce when it should be a natural part of the whole recruitment process.
Yeah, Exactly. Kaja, would you like to continue on this? Just a moment.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, I have to agree with my co-panelists here and just piggyback a bit on what they've said, because the first point that William made, that we haven't really tried, I thoroughly agree with, because there is a lack of political commitment to doing something about this. And I think that we have some deep ingrained ableism that goes back a long way, that makes the general population quite acceptive of people with disabilities being shut out of the labor force. And we have, just look at the politics that we have in Norway. We had inclusive working life agreement for 17 years with a goal of including more people with disabilities. And they didn't succeed, and I think that's because they didn't really try. The goal was there, but there was no force behind it. And we also implemented an anti-discrimination law, but there's no really accountability behind that law. So the structures for enforcing these commitments is very weak. And I also think, as Tor Andreas said, that it is a heterogeneity in this group. There's very much variation that is not acknowledged. And I think if we really tried, we would see this and make different types of policies for these different kinds of people with different needs, because some need a lot of support, some need the job centers and work and welfare administration, but some do not. They need more inclusive hiring processes where these discriminatory tendencies are acknowledged. And so we need to work in different sectors and along different paths to make this work. And I also think, as we see this in Norway, and it seems like it's the same way in Denmark, that the unemployment rate is increasing. So there's something happening also with the labor market. And we're going into a more, I think, intense and productivity-oriented labor market. And it's not that disabled people are not necessarily productive if they get a chance, but the idea is that they're not. And if employers really feel that they have to produce a lot, to make it less interested in addressing this topic. So that's a few reasons I think that we're not improving.
Very good. Thank you, Kaja. William, would you like to add something?
Yeah, it's short, so we can go to the next questions. I can see there are some in the chats, but I just want to say that in Denmark we have a scientist that researches in disability, and he has a quite nice motto. He says that there are two people in this world. There are people with disabilities, and there are people who will get disabilities some days, someday. I just think that's very interesting. It's yeah, it's a problem that's in every life.
My research from this, when I go talk to the employers, it's the fact that when we talk about adaptations, it is very oversighted, very much different things we can do for different people. It's hard to get it down to the specific needs of the one that is in the workforce asking for adaptations. So to get it down on a practical level is what worked when we talked to the employers as well. And then especially to have such of a, I think our biggest success with our customers in Norway is to have a sort of support line. When employers has one concrete case, they call us and they say, what can we do? This is the issue. What is possible? Many of the times the candidate knows the possibilities themselves, but especially young people in the workforce that doesn't know the whole picture might not be aware of the possibilities for adaptation as well. So the conversation also when it comes to adaptation is one that employers find difficult. like what am I allowed to ask, what am I not allowed to ask. And since I'm unsure, I prefer not to ask because I'm afraid I'll then say something wrong. But when they then call us and we say, well, this is the possibilities and solutions that goes into the problem that you address. But if we have a conversation with the candidate and employers as well, we usually make the link. And it's much less demanding than the employers seem to think in advance. But that demands a well known knowledge base on what is able to get adapted and what is not able. So we've specialized in that. And we also recommend that employers has one person that has an in-depth knowledge that can help the other employees to find those adaptations as well. So that's what we've seen work for us.
Thank you so much. William or Kaya, do you have any comments on this, or should we go forward?
I can make it very short if it is. So I think it's true that we need more knowledge about different accommodations, but we also need to make the structural system around these accommodations a lot easier to navigate. In Denmark, we see that there are some very big companies that don't want to try to get these accommodations through the municipality because it takes too much time, and when they are big companies, they decide to pay for the accommodations themselves because they see it's important, and they don't have time to wait for municipalities and different administration processes. So we can definitely make them a lot easier to navigate.
Yeah, I can just chime in and say that I really want more knowledge. I want more research on the processes that happen after hiring, because I do not think that we know enough about what happens then. And I have seen research that indicates that these employed disabled people, they have a lower pay than non-disabled employed people. And you see there's something that happens that when employed non-disabled people, the pay gets higher and higher the older you get, and that doesn't happen for disabled people. So there is something about the opportunities that you get also after you're hired. And I think these are mechanisms that we also need to look into, because it doesn't help if you get the job if it's hell getting the accommodations that you need.
Yeah, and that's extremely important. I think that we need to work a lot more with the different HR departments in the workplaces, because they don't know what to do with people with disabilities if there are different problems there.
Yeah, Tor. Sorry, just a moment.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to chime in there as well to see, well, these are very well known and familiar arguments when you go back to getting the gender in the workforce back in the 20s, 30s, 40s. We heard the same things. We heard the same difficulties finding out what they can do. They were alone at the home. There was a newspaper thing back in the 20s where HR argumented that we can't have women in the workforce because men get less productive. So it's not an unusual trait and a way of thinking, but I also think we can learn a lot from previous equality fights, both with gender, ethnic minority, and see what did we actually do back in time. And I usually say that our fight with people with disability, for my side, is experienced as sort of the same step in about the 1960s when it comes to equal rights for women. So we're about 60 years behind, but I think we can amplify the movement by learning from previous experiences.
Thank you. These presentations were really interesting. How do you suggest that us organizations/disabled people concretely meet employers? Have you done any projects where you affect the employers? Anyone on this question? Tor, Andreas?
Let's see if I unmuted first now. Did I do it? Yeah.
Good.
Great. Well, we are, as I said, an organization owned by the Norwegian Association of Disabled, and our main goal is to work with employers. And when it comes to getting disabled people and meeting the employer's needs, we go in and have workshop with the employers, trying to figure out what is going to change at this workplace with the hiring of people with disability. Because if we always have the same kind of people, and when we say best qualified for the job, and you have that cookie cutter recipe where there are usually ethnically Norwegian people in the age 20 to 40 being best qualified, then suddenly is not possible to achieve based on the discriminative story of the society as well. So when we go into companies and then ask, well, what is going to be different? How is the hiring a person with disability going to improve the business strategy and improve how sales or what you offer as services gets better by doing so? Then they actually start having a conversation about what's our room, what's our goal with hiring those people. And what we see from there is that we move away from we need to hire people because we want to give back, we want to take our responsibility, social construct argumentation over to that business relaxation. We see that the companies that we have certified in recruitment actually end up hiring about 300% more candidates of disability and more structured, not by sheer luck in the system and the right person, but they go in and qualifiedly hire people because they need. And one example of this is, that was said earlier with the Convention of the Rights for People with Disabilities, CRPD. Uh, a lot of Norwegian municipalities and others now have to work with what rights does it give us, what possibilities does it give us. So if the municipality now going to have a new administrative employer, they should list knowledge and experience with the consequence of CRPD as a qualitative measure when you are going to hire a new person, which makes people with disability more qualified because they have that basis of knowledge with CRPD. So that's just one example of how we work with best qualified as a system for people with disability.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, and here we go. How can we influence the perception of the ideal worker in the society and as a whole, and especially among employers? Kaja, please, go ahead.
Yes, I think that we shouldn't really influence the perception of the ideal worker. We should reject it because, as William said, it doesn't exist. So instead, we need to just see people as people. And then if I think about all my colleagues, there are different people with different skill sets and different strengths, and they're not the same. So we should not expect people to fit into this mold because that's not what people are like. That's my answer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tor?
Yeah, and just to chime in on that as well, it's like when we talk about, let's say we have 10 people with PhDs lined up next to each other, we all acknowledge that those are 10 very different people with different needs, different ambitions, different knowledge. But when it comes to people with disability, we just see, 10 people in a wheelchair, and the assumption is that they're all have the same needs or the same development. And what I do like about that is our argument when it comes to recruitment, especially, is that we kind of have to rehumanize it because we are recruiting based on your resume and usually then your education levels and your prior work experience. but we need to go into who we're actually hiring. And research from World Economic Forum, Randstad, and other companies as well has pointed out that personal, as long as you're qualified, so if you're going to work with the economy, you need to know economy. But as long as that is fulfilled, it's the personal traits that makes if you succeed or not. It's the problem solving skills. It's the how you relate to other people, how you build teams. That is the one that determines if you succeed as a company. But we don't measure that in the recruitment. We measure the number of years being educated, the number of years being in the workforce. And when we talk about personal skills, then we already selected out the diversity and disability that we should gain from.
Thank you. And William, any last comments?
Yeah, lastly, I would like to say that we need to put more spotlight on ableism. I think there's a lot of people who don't believe in ableism or don't see it in their everyday life and feel like the structural discrimination doesn't exist in our Nordic fantastic countries. So we need to put spotlight on ableism and help people to see where discrimination takes place in everyday life and on the structural sphere.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our webinar, unfortunately. Now, if you missed anything or would like to revisit any of the presentation slides that were seen earlier, they will all be visible in the recording. And I will send out an email once the recording is uploaded and ready to view on our website, niva.org. Now, a warm thank you to our speakers today and to everyone who joined us for this webinar today. And thank you to the Nordic Welfare Center for this cooperation. I wish you all a lovely spring season. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.